Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Boys in the Cave. My name is Tanzim and I'm your solo co-host for today. And today I'm joined by political activist Uthman Badar. So to jump straight into it, everyone knows about the unfortunate events that occurred in Christchurch. So the Boys in the Cave wanted to cover the whole incident and also talk not just about what happened, but also discuss what we can do as a community, as well as other details, because I'm sure a lot of people are in pain. The Muslim Ummah were meant to be like a whole body. So it's been really terrible. Even with my family, they've been really, stricken with grief, and everyone, all my friends have been really suffering because it's really hurt us deep because we never really expected it to happen. So as people, just to give a quick recap, so what's happened is that a mass shooting had taken place at a mosque at Masjid Al Noor in Hagley Park in Christchurch, New Zealand at 1:40 p.m. local time. And the Linwood Mosque was also targeted. So the death toll stands at 50. It was 49. So I think a few hours ago, they actually found an extra body underneath all the bodies that are lying in the masjid. And I think there's roughly 38 people that are actually being cared for in the Christchurch hospital. And I think a few actually, someone passed away last night. So according to the reports, I think there were 4 people that were charged, and there were 3 male, 1 female. So this has been an emotional situation, not just for the Muslim community, but for humanity at large. So me and Uthman, and also the person who did the shootings, we know the Australian bloke, we're all based in Sydney, so actually hits closer to home knowing that the shooter was Australian. So what do you make of the situation that's happened 2 days ago, Uthman?
Assalamu alaikum, Tanzim. Assalamu alaikum to all your listeners. Subhanallah, it's been very much a roller coaster. I think a roller coaster of emotions and also of events. I remember on mid-afternoon Friday evenings. Usually we have some classes that I prepare for, and I spent most of the day preparing for that. But as the news of the events came in and what it meant filtered through, straight away things started happening. So I got a message saying classes cancelled. There's going to be a gathering. Emergency gathering outside Lakemba Station, a message from the Lakemba Mosque saying there's going to be Salat al-Janaza in absence. And obviously once you start getting into it, obviously hundreds of Muslims gathered. It's just been very much a roller coaster in that respect. Obviously what actually took place was horrendous. I mean, any human being of a sound fitra is, you hate that sort of, your self or your soul pushes you away from that sort of. It's very horrific to see that sort of killing, and of course in our time there's a certain it's also surreal. Some people compared the video image to a computer game. At the same time there's a distance. You feel very grieved, you feel very horrified, you feel angry, but there's also a distance. Although as you said, it's very close to us in Australia for a number of reasons which we'll discuss, but it's still 2 or 3, 4 hours away. You can't actually be there to assist and help in the way you might have if you were in that community. But these are the realities that we live. So it's very much been a roller coaster that has been quite a difficult period for the Muslim community, I believe.
It is very difficult because I think we actually touched on the live streaming. Might as well bring it up now. It did feel like it was a computer game, and because I did a post on my Facebook, I mentioned how I feel that the community is really grieving because it felt like we were there and we saw the mindset of the shooter in action. And actually, I feel a lot of people are posting on Facebook to not check out the video, don't check out the live stream, but I think everyone has, because or else why would you post it? But subhanAllah, it is not something, a human being should witness. And I think that's why the community can actually understand what actually happened. Because you see, I think I'll touch on what Ali said, but I think it was like, going to Jummah is like a fish in a barrel. You're just open to attack, and you'll have nowhere to defend yourself because you're just praying to Allah, subhanAllah. So what's your take on that? It's the fact that because of the live stream, we're able to actually felt like we were there while it was happening, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think even apart from the live stream, as you probably noted, I saw a lot of comments on social media by Muslims saying, look, I've sat in the mosque, whether in Jummah or other times, and thought, what if someone came in now and attacked, and going through the scenarios. I read that post, one of the first posts on Friday, and I thought to myself, damn, that's right. I've done that in my mind numerous times.
Well, I've done it sometimes.
Even though it's never happened in Australia. But I think what that speaks to is a broader climate. It speaks to a broader environment, a broader climate that has been the reality for Muslims for a long time now in the West. But I think this actually happening just brings it so much closer to home, figuratively speaking. And what that means is just the stakes are much higher, and all of a sudden, obviously, it's a much greater possibility that this type of thing may happen. And to the extent that that's the case, obviously people are concerned and people are worried, and it's concerning times.
Yeah, you mentioned the climate, and the fact that we're actually going through this scenario means that the climate actually forces us to think in such a way. And subhanAllah, I think even though we play the scenario in our head, we don't actually envision it happening. And then subhanAllah, it actually did happen 2 days ago. And I know there's been like many reports around the world. I think in England there was like an attack. I think even locally, like a sister got her hijab removed, an attack. So it's actually like a sort of flow-on effect. Do you think that because of the attack itself, it's actually triggering reactions worldwide? Like, what's the take on that at this point in time?
It's possible. I think because there's been a lot of, generally speaking, there's been a lot of condemnation. It's been taken very negatively, as it should be, around the world by 99.9% of people. And so I think it's a difficult time for anyone to copy it. But again, the point is the larger context. It may not happen tomorrow or today, except isolated incidents, as you mentioned. But the greater concern, which has already been the case before this, and now the stakes are higher, is of where the future leads us, and it very much looks to be very concerning in that respect.
I want to hone in on the actual shooter. So he's a 28-year-old man from Australia who was charged with murder and appeared Saturday morning in a Christchurch courtroom. The court papers identified him as Brenton Harris Tarrant. The New Zealand police said that he would face additional charges. So second man, I think he's 18, was also charged with intent to excite hostility or ill will. So what I think has come out in terms of the shooter himself, it's a bit, can't really explain it, because when I think of such situation, I don't know why, but I suddenly think of Muslims. Like, for example, when you hear, there's a Muslim that did an attack, and the papers are trying to figure who he is and stuff. What they don't dig, they dig into his past, but they pick and choose certain things to make a case that he is just a radical extremist in Islam and stuff. But what's happened with this particular bloke, he did have a manifesto, which we can talk about later, but because he is a white guy, and he was a alt-right extremist of that nature, and you've been getting messages, we've been finding out that his past, his dad passed away, something like that. Like, they're trying to cushion the whole story just a tad bit without actually calling it what it is. I know a lot of leaders around the world said it is a terrorist act. At the same time, to me, I feel that what the agenda is here is that they're pushing for a narrative of gun laws. Like, okay, because the action happened, I have to change the gun laws, right? So that's the narrative that's being pushed. It's not really focusing on the person or on alt-right conservative extremists. But what's your take on that sort of scenario at this point in time?
I think it's probably going to be a few things, as we've seen most politicians, most leaders around the world have, as you'd expect. I mean, this is not something you can try to justify. They have come out against and spoken against this. But what we have to be careful of here is not to lose sight of the bigger picture. And I think we'll come and speak about the broader reaction of the community in a bit. But you don't want to lose sight of things and scapegoat certain groups or certain phenomena. So I think there will be some level of coming down or targeting of the so-called far right. But I don't think that's sufficient, right? And part of the problem here is that in the broader climate, in the broader context of the war on terror, which is the most defining feature of these sort of incidents and has been for the last 2 decades, there are certain things that are already in place and are mainstream and are norms that are resulting in what we're seeing. So when you say, like, you know, the way this murderer, this terrorist has been portrayed is different in important respects to how, you know, it's portrayed when it's a Muslim. That's true, but I don't think in this case any journalist sitting there and trying to give him a good picture. Like, you'd be nuts to do that, right? But it's just, that's how it is. And the broader context has it such that when it comes to Muslim and Islam, it's within a broader war on terror. There's a war, right? There's a big campaign. It's an existential threat, right? Whereas anyone else, it's a problem, no doubt. It's not something you want to happen or anyone wants to happen, but it's isolated. It's some extremist, right? And you can tell that. So, for instance, you know, it's clear even when some Muslim does the wrong thing of this nature, so much of the time Islam is brought into the picture. So they'll be saying, oh, he's an extremist, it's an extreme interpretation of Islam, it's radicalism, but Islam's in the picture. When we talk about the far right, now clearly the far right is an extreme end of the right, but we never talk about the right when the far right does something wrong. You don't make those links because you know, they can't. If they make those links, what, you're making a link to conservatism, to secularism, to liberalism, to, you know, that's the foundations of Western civilization. So that really that starts to unravel some of these layers that we should be looking at when things like this happen. But the point here is that certain structures, certain norms, certain ways of understanding things are already in place, and that's not going to change overnight, even when something like this happens. And we shouldn't be fooled when, you know, people present nominal reactions or nominal responses in words, unless their actions also change.
So would you say that, let's just say, if the media, like, you know, they portray ISIS as Muslims and Islam and it's the bedrock of Islamic ideology, would you say that if you take that same understanding, if the media were really about painting the fair picture, if they wouldn't just refer to him some extremist far right guy, it would be like, because he's Christian, obviously, he's like, he should be like, the papers should be saying Christian, you know, he's a Christian, he's propagating the Christian faith. So is that if the media was really fair, should they have painted him in that sort of scenario?
Yeah, I wouldn't say Christian. If you read his manifesto and the stuff he's saying, I'm sure there's a Christian background there, but it's, you know, there's fascism, there's nationalism, they're more secular, modern secular ideologies. And so, yes, if there was, obviously the media is not like that, we don't expect them to be like that, but what exposes the double standard is when it is a Muslim, for instance, all of a sudden the question is raised, you know, what is it within Islam? What are the ideas within Islam that give rise to these types of views and these types of actions? So all of a sudden Islam's in the dock, right? All of a sudden Muslim community leaders are expected, and it's so natural, right? So natural that they do it. So many of them do it before they're asked to do it, are expected to condemn and come out and speak against it and to do more about it and to take responsibility, right? Yet when we come here now, okay, so the guys are the far right, why don't you ask the question, what is it within secularism, what is it within conservatism that gives rise to these ideas? What is it within liberalism, right? The question's not even asked. Likewise, apparently there's no community now, there's no leaders that can be asked or that should be asked to take responsibility, to condemn, to do more about it. No, it's an isolated thing. And, you know, and so the double standard is clear. What it should be the case is, yes, in all communities, there are people who do extreme crimes. When someone does a crime, treat it as a crime and do it as an isolated incident. Let the authorities do their job. But that's not the case. We know, we've lived for 2 decades. When it's a Muslim, it's a completely different reaction. And, you know, the whole apparatus goes into overdrive, which is what causes the problem. So I think this is where we need to focus the light.
So I understand in the sense that people should be asking what aspects of secularism is allowing people like himself to do such actions. Would you say, like, as a Muslim, what brings about those ideas? Like, would you point it down to, parts of secularism? Would you just say, how we grew up? Like, what would you pin it down to? That makes sense.
Look, in this case, to be clear, what I was saying is that if there wasn't this double standard, if there was consistency, they would ask that question.
Yeah,
personally, I don't think the actions of some isolated nut job necessarily need to be tied to some broader community. I think there's a problem when you do that. However, when we start to open up and see what's happening, when you see that there's a climate and an environment of Islamophobia, which comes not from some extreme fringes, but from the mainstream, right? When you actually shed light on what mainstream powers have been doing over the last couple of decades, and long before that, when it comes to the Muslim world, that's where the very violent nature of modern secularism comes to the fore. So for me, it's not something that this Breivik does, or something that this guy does, Harrison, as an isolated incident. For me, it's the hundreds of thousands of people whose lives have been destroyed by states. That's where we should ask and say, well, what is it within secularism? And there's a lot quite there that can be unpacked, probably beyond the scope of our discussion today, but would really show that modern secularity, liberalism, democracy, regardless of the very romantic pictures that these ideas bring to the fore in the minds of people, because that's how they've been constructed, that these are very extremely violent ideologies that have caused havoc on a mass scale in modern times.
And so how would you say the government, or it can be talk about specifically Australia, how is Australia's the Australian government's reaction to the whole incident that's occurred? And what do you make of it?
Well, as I said, look, what took place was a horrendous act of cold-blooded murder. No one's in a position to justify or to say, or to do anything other than condemn it. And so Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, although in his initial commentary he was want not to use the word terrorism, but he had to. It was so obvious. So they have come out, and everyone's saying it's a terrorist act, and it's condemnable, and it's bad, and we can't have this, and that's good. However, we really need to be smarter than to be fooled by the words of people and the politicians in particular. Like, everyone knows these politicians will say whatever needs to be said in whatever situation. It's about the actions. And so my concern here is that these actions of the government, the politician, the opposition leader, don't mean anything in terms of them changing their general approach. If we recognize that these sort of horrific events are led up to, or are facilitated, or are contributed to by the broader climate, which is produced by these very people, then we need to be smarter than to be fooled by words, right? Scott Morrison's actions over the last decade, speak much more loudly than one tweet or one condemnation of this particular event. So we can't forget that. And so in general, I would say that the government has said what it needs to say. We can't really say anything else, but these words ring hollow in comparison to their actions.
Would you say it's like crocodile tears?
Politically, yes. Now, I don't want to say at a human individual level. I'm sure that people like Bill Shorten and Scott Morrison have some semblance of a heart in their bodies, and what they saw, they were also, horrified by what they saw. But at a political level, at a level of agenda, at a level of narrative, at a level of politics, their actions, their speech, what they've done over so long has contributed to this. There's no doubt about that. And so we don't expect some magical change on their part. It's about what we do. We need to be smarter than to, for instance, be rubbing shoulders with them now and opening our arms and saying, oh, we're mourning together. We're united in this. What are you talking about? Like, you can't seriously on the one hand say there's a climate that leads to this. We need to interrogate that. We need to, things need to change. And then, turn around and rub shoulders with the same people who are the pillars of creating the environment, that climax. So I think there needs to be some further introspection in terms of the Muslim community, and particularly its leadership, in terms of how we respond.
Okay, because Scott Morrison, I think it was like a few months ago, there was an incident where I think the government wanted Muslim leaders to condemn an act. I forgot. So they weren't able to gather everyone up to condemn it. And yesterday, I think what happened is at the Lebanese Muslim Association, so the LMA, he actually did a sit down, like sort of, I don't know, press conference or whatever it was. So he was able to do that. So what do you make of that? What should be our approach? Was that the right approach to go about it? How should we have, I guess, reacted?
Yeah, no, look, we have to be honest about this. It's been too long, and the consequences are too fatal. We now know how high the stakes are of this. The response of these sort of leaders, the LMA and of the Imams Council, is absolutely wrong, and there's no two ways about that. What the incident you're referring to is just a few months ago. Scott Morrison was being he's doing his normal thing as he does, but blaming Islam, blaming Muslims, asking the community to do more. Again, so ascribing the responsibility of some isolated incident to the community itself. And at that point, the leaders did what was right, and to say, no, you can't do that. And they pushed back a little bit, right? And he just ignored it. He ignored it, slap in the face, no, I'm right, you're wrong, and we'll move on. So today, when he turns around and says, oh, I'm mourning with you, why would we open our mosques and our press conference and rub shoulder and have photo shoots with him? It makes no sense whatsoever. So, I'd like to put this question to these sorts of leaders and say, look, what are you doing? As I said, you cannot, on the one hand, because he's one of the spokespeople for one of these community organizations yesterday had a press conference alongside the police commission, and he mentioned most of his commentary was about how things are difficult. It's a difficult time for the Muslim community. There's concerns about security and so on and so forth. And in the end, he made a point about how, the media needs to be responsible and the government needs to be responsible. There's a climate that leads up to this situation. And that's a fair point, although it came across in that situation as more of a footnote, whereas I think that's where the focus should have been. But the very next day, if you're going to be, as I said, rubbing shoulders with Scott Morrison, one of the pillars of, the institutions and the Liberal Party, for example, the government, who has played an instrumental role in leading to that climate, then you're just contradicting yourself. And more importantly than that, is this really the way that the Muslim community should be pushing back and putting the focus where it should be? Instead of fine, Morrison says, I want to come and mourn with you guys. I'm not saying be silly about it, be dignified about it and say, hang on a minute, this is what you've done in the past. And, this is unacceptable. It's this very climate, it's these very actions that you've been at the forefront of that lead to these sort of incidents. Now, if you did that, all of a sudden you do what you can to put that aspect of the discussion at the core of the public discourse and the public debate. But now what's happening now is when, so people are going, oh, the community needs to be united and we come together. And, apparently Fraser Anning, who is the big problem against which the whole community should unite. Now, of course, Senator Fraser Anning, what he said was absolutely ridiculous. It was atrocious. But he's an attention seeker. He's scratching the bottom of the barrel. You'd be silly to make him the issue, right? But that's what tends to happen in the situations, and all that is a reaffirmation of the war on terror narrative. Because if we pay attention to the war on terror narrative, it's basically to say that Muslim and Islam, extreme interpretations of Islam are a problem. There's extremism. Our foreign policy is not a problem. It's ignored. It's not there. Whatever we do is fine. In terms of the state, the media, the federal police, Asia, etc. And when originally the far right wasn't even in the picture, but when they started doing things, the narrative became, oh, extremists on both sides are the problem. So you have to be careful. You're playing that same narrative when you say, we all got to be united, when we're intending is you and Scott Morrison and Bill Shorten and the media and the police. All of us apparently need to be united against the far right, and the extremists on the other side. So you've made the two extremists a problem. Well, they are a problem. They are a serious problem, but you've missed out the fact that the biggest issue and the greatest violence comes actually from the mainstream itself.
I can't really dispute much there, but because I know a lot of close people at LMA, but I guess from a practical point of view, it is difficult as an organization when you're running a big organization that's prominent in the community, where this sort of situation arises, and then you have the government kind of knocking on your door being I I guess there will be an element of forcefulness involved in order to get this up and going. Because if they sort of say no to it, it'll look really bad on their part, saying, you know, maybe the government can make a spin on it, saying, you know, why won't the Muslim community allow us to do, you know, pay condolences and this and that. So on a practical level, you know, LMA can argue that it's not easy to kind of resist the idea of them coming to you and doing this, setting up this press conference, on the fact that you said like the conversation should be directed on the whole picture, which is the government, the media at large, who's actually created such a situation in order for such deaths to occur in the first place. But what's your kind of take on that sort of, you know, on a practical level?
Yeah, look, that's fine. I'm not saying it's easy, right? But we live in difficult times, and you have to, that's the whole point. As a Muslim, we're asked to take a principled stance, even when it's against ourselves or our families, let alone, you know, someone else. And so the principled stance always comes at a sacrifice. But let's keep things in perspective here. The sacrifice is not, you know, you're not paying the ultimate price. You're not even being harmed. You're just taking a strong stance against the government. And to credit where these organizations have taken something of such a stance in the past. So, for example, they've been invited to certain AFP iftars, for example, or so, where they've said, no, we're not coming. So again, the point is not to say that you act in a rash or a harsh manner. It's just that you be firm and dignified and say, we will not stop you. So we're not saying you can't mourn or you can't pass on your condolences. Do that in your own platforms, but don't do that with us, because, all right? And there's a because, and this is where you put your own narrative down, and this is where you try and push the public discourse in the right direction, because you've done this, you've said this. A few months ago, you said this, and we asked you to take it back, and you turned the other way, right? So, and the point is, if you're not going to do that, then you know, there's no point behind closed doors saying, yes, Scott Morrison's the problem, the government's the problem, the media's a problem. What's the point of saying one thing privately and doing something else publicly? So yes, it's not easy, but the principled stance is what we have to do, first and foremost, as a responsibility to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his messenger, and responsibility to the ummah.
Yeah, you bring up a good point that we do need to put the focus on where it is, because the idea is that because we get all our information through the media and through the government, they aren't going to take responsibility for creating such circumstances in the first place, right? And it's really heartbreaking that they're not going to, you know, own up to it per se. All the articles is going to deflect from the situation at large. But, you know, I guess that's why the shooter actually live streamed in the first place, to gain that more exposure. You know, it does kind of, focusing on those sort of little instances do deflect from the whole picture, the whole narrative that the government and the media are actually contributing to this specific event. And you could argue that, would you say that the government is putting enough like protocols in place, for example? Because we know, like we'll probably touch on later, the idea of, you know, now, you know, people are fearing to go to the masjid, simple as that, because we don't have that security, you know, those security guards at the front of the doors, for example. Do you think that the Australian government is actually taking steps forward in order to make sure such situation doesn't occur in the future?
I mean, it's early days at this point. I know that the police have put extra police patrols around Masajid, but obviously they can only do that for a day or two, a few days. That can't be a regular thing. Secondly, obviously, it's not the government's responsibility in origin here to provide private security to, you know, Masajid and other places of worship. But I'm sure, look, I don't doubt that the security apparatuses of the state will do what they need to do to keep the peace in the country. That's their job, and they should do that. The issue is not that. The issue is that part and parcel of that is the same institutions, the same apparatus is used in a very violent and very problematic way, and you need to push back against that. So what you can't do is sort of go, well, look, we need the police to protect us, and therefore when the AFP does its raids and does them in a very, very problematic way, and in a way that actually fosters and facilitates the climate of Islamophobia, we can't say anything, because then how are we going to build relations with them? You know what I mean? Or, you know, how can we say no to the Prime Minister when he's the one who is in the position of power? So we need to keep good relations so he can do this and he can do that, which really gets to the essence of the issue. You know, when you said that it's difficult for large organizations to take these stances against power, against people in power or institutions of power. The point is, yes, that's true, but in a sense, you took an approach that puts you in that difficult situation. When you are so engrossed in the various webs of the state, funding and this and relations and so on and so forth, and engagement in quotation marks and square quotes, you put yourself in that situation. But you got to ask a very serious question here. And this has been, and the problem is, this is not new. What's new about New Zealand, or what's new about Christchurch, it's closer to home. It's something that we in the West can feel as something that we can relate to more, right? But these type of things where people are killed indiscriminately or innocent people are killed has been happening. It's almost a norm in the Muslim world, in various parts of the Muslim world. So we want to also avoid here the sort of special pleading just because we're in the West, and now all of a sudden things are much worse for us, and now that we have to treat this in a way that's much more different. Obviously, it's closer to home, so you take the necessary precautions, but in the bigger picture, you got to ask these more difficult questions. We can have a look here, for example, at what has been. In other words, we need to learn the lessons. If you look at the situation of what's happened globally over the past 10 or 20 years, everyone knew. When Muslims talk about it, when these same leaders talk about it, they know that foreign policy is one of the biggest contributing factors to what is called terrorism around the world. But every time it happened, and every time you said, look, talk about foreign policy, you'd say, oh, look, we can't talk about foreign policy because then the government will say this or will say that, and it's not kosher, right? Sort of taboo to talk about it. It's okay, so you're not going to talk about it. What are you going to talk about? You're going to condemn this person, you're going to condemn that person, you're going to go along with the mainstream narrative. Where does that lead you? Right? So it's the same thing now when it becomes at a local level. We can all gang up on the nut job who is Senator Fraser Anning, but that's not going to help you, because in a month's time from now, when everyone forgets about Christchurch, the media is going to go back to doing what it does. Scott Morrison is going to go back to doing what he does. Bill Shorten's going to do the same thing, right? Then what? So at some point, the Muslim community as a whole, its leadership, its organizations, need to step back and go, we need to go back to the drawing board about our overall approach to these issues, which put us in a situation where we feel shy or ashamed, or we don't have the courage to say to the Prime Minister, no, stop making a joke out of us and stop making us look silly and stop taking us for fools. This can't happen anymore.
Good analysis you talked about in terms of getting the whole picture, because obviously it is a very tragic incident, like 50 people, getting shot dead in cold blood, but at the end of the day, the government, they do that, in the Muslim land, they're doing
That's right. It's a normal occurrence.
Exactly. And as we're saying, because it's, happened in the West per se, that's why it hits closer to us, because, we live in the West specifically, but it's about being cognizant of the fact that we don't fall into the whole narrative and just backpedaling whatever the government and the media say. And because, it's not easy for a Muslim, like a lay kind of nobody like myself, to really take in these ideas and being bombarded with the idea, the government's acting in this way in Muslim countries, that people are going to attack you on the street, and then this sort of incident occurs. But as a Muslim, what can we do? Because you mentioned the whole problem is pinpointing the issue, which is, the government, the media. But then as a normal Muslim, day-to-day Muslim, what can we do to sort of fix the situation, or what can we do to make sure such incidents don't occur in the future? What can we do to essentially change the discourse, I guess?
Yeah, look, we can do a lot. Before we come to the discourse, obviously 50 Muslims have been killed here. We can and we must make dua. We must do the things that are our responsibility in terms of our Muslimness, this bond of Islam that is so strong. And subhanAllah, we've seen a lot of positives from the ummah as well, from the common ummah, people on the street. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, have prayed Salat al-Janaza in absentia on these brothers and sisters, and they don't know who they are, they don't know their names. That's the power of the bond of La ilaha illallah. That we're all moved around, all of us are moved around the world from what we saw. And so dua is number one. there are organizations who are, working at good initiatives to assist in terms of on the ground, in terms of the janaza, in terms of charity and so on and so forth. We should be part of that wherever we can. But even when you come to your actual question about change moving forward, there's a lot we can do, but we need to sort of rewire the thinking a little bit there. If an individual is thinking about how I can fix things and how I can make sure this doesn't happen again, he's going to say, I can't do anything. Right? So the question should be more in a sense of, how can I contribute to moving in the right direction, right? As an individual, as a community, and obviously as an ummah. As an ummah, we have the resource to do a lot more. But what you can do as an individual is to contribute by pushing the discourse and the narrative in the right direction, right? So you understand what's happening here. And to be honest, I think most Muslims do understand. And there needs to be little tweaks here or there. Unfortunately, a lot of those who put themselves in positions of leaderships or find themselves in positions of leaderships because they embroil themselves in the institutions, the mainstream institutions, then they're forced to sort of take these much more problematic stances. But I think by and large, the Ummah understands, but it's about being more proactive, about taking part in discussions, about pushing things in the right direction, right? So for yourself, communicate or propagate the right narrative, push back against the mainstream wrong narrative, right? Now, at the same time, you can go further by, when you hear that wrong narrative within the community, hold it up in a nice way, in a dignified way, in a respectable way. When you hear it from your imam, speak to him. When for example, these leaders that have come and, had this photo shoot with Scott Morrison and sat down with him and done their engagement, they all of them are going to go back to some mosque or some masjid or some school or some chaplaincy where they cater for or serve the Muslim community. The community on the ground should ask them these difficult questions, right? And this is where the community can be more proactive. Unfortunately, we also have, in some parts of the community, we have this attitude where they're scholars. I'm a nobody. What can I do? What can I say? No, it's not like that. Just because someone's a scholar, he's got a particular expertise. Someone knows fiqh and aqidah doesn't mean he knows politics. Doesn't mean he knows, how the war and terror works. Doesn't mean he understands racism. It doesn't mean he understands the social sciences and how modern society works. Things have to be put in their place. When something is clear that an action is wrong, everyone can play their part in trying to push it in the right direction. And that's what Allah wants of you. Again, to make this practicable. Allah's not holding you to account to make sure another Christchurch doesn't happen. That's outside your control. But He will hold you to account for whatever you could have done to push things in the right direction. And that's all we need to do, and we need to do it sincerely for the sake of Allah. And may Allah give us the tawfiq to do that.
I mean, those are really good takeaway points, which a lot of people benefit. I do want to quickly show a quick video because Walid Ali is pretty prominent here in Australia, and people overseas might not know him. He's Muslim. He's in the mainstream media. He actually said a heartfelt message. I want to get your thoughts in it, but I will play it now. So just bear with me. Just let me know if it comes up. Did it come up, Uthman?
Yep.
All right, I'll play it now.
I also know that the leader of one of those parties that denounced him once described Islam as a disease Australia needs to vaccinate. And even that party is kind of on the fringes, despite some valiant attempts by our media to change that. But I also know a senior figure in our government once suggested we made a mistake as a country by letting in Lebanese Muslims in the 70s. And I know there are media reports going back 8 years of a shadow cabinet meeting in which another senior politician suggested his party should use community concerns about Muslims in Australia failing to integrate as a political strategy. That person's now the most senior politician we have. So while I appreciate the words our leaders have said today, and in particular Scott Morrison's comments and his preparedness to call this terrorism and the strength of his comments more generally, I have something to ask. Don't change your tune now because the terrorism seems to be coming from a white supremacist. If you've been talking about being tough on terrorism for years in the communities that allegedly support it, then show us how tough you are now. For mine, I'm going to say the same thing I said about 4 years ago after a horrific Islamist attack. Now we come together. Now we understand this is not a game. Terrorism doesn't choose its victims selectively, that we are one community, and that everything we say to try to tear people apart, demonise particular groups, set them against each other, that all has consequences, even if we're not the ones with our fingers on the trigger.
Yeah, so give me a few moments, because I can definitely agree with his sentiments. The fact that it's like, you know, Muslims are just so bombarded by the government and the media, and they're the ones that actually influence these people, if that makes sense. So it's really tough to, you know, it goes back to what you were saying before, like in terms of crocodile tears, you know, that's what it feels like. Like, just don't change your tune. Like he's telling that because it happened, because it's a white person, don't change your tune in terms of attacking. Like, if you're really fair as a government, holistically tackle terrorism. Don't just pinpoint on Muslims, you know. Like, if you have different groups doing different types of terrorism, fine, but label it as it is, you know what I mean? Don't kind of demonize the whole Muslim community. But what's your sort of analysis on what he said?
Obviously, he makes some good points there, and the background music assists in the propagation or the conveying of a strong message. However, if I would be frank, I think, you know, the account he's holding to account of the government and the mainstream just doesn't go far enough there. It's sort of, he's alluding to it, and he's, you know, he's appreciative of Scott Morrison's calling it a terrorism. I don't understand why anyone's appreciative of people saying the obvious. Obviously, it's a terrorist attack. Like, you know, just because I said that should really not mean anything. But the point is here again, if you step back and look at what's the narrative that Walid is pushing here, it's the same one. It's we should be united. Who's the we? Should be united. We, the government, the media, everyone come together against the extremes, right? So the extremes are being made the scapegoat here. Whereas, although they are a serious problem that need to be dealt with, are you seriously asking the government to help you in deal with the problem? Like, you're asking those who are not just part of the problem, they are the problem, right? And this is the point that you really have to understand, that although it's difficult to, you know, it's a difficult point to perhaps articulate or to digest, but this is what it is. And that's why the examples, so I'll take issue with the examples that he's using. So he was alluding there to stuff that Pauline Hanson said, or stuff that, you know, Fraser Anning said. These are people on the extremes, and he alluded to Scott Morrison, who's been pretty extreme himself in the past, and he still is. But the real examples should be, you know, the invasion of Afghanistan and the invasion of Iraq, where an entire nation was decimated, not by Pauline Hanson, but by John Howard. You know, so in fact, I saw a clip this morning, incidentally, where John Howard himself is saying, you know, in front of some media channel, and he's saying, oh, look, I want to add my voice to all those who are grieving and all those who are, you know, I want to condemn this attack as an attack against humanity or something like that. And like, obviously everyone can say that, but you've done things that, you know, people like this dude here, Brenton, whatever his name is, Tarrison, they can dream of doing things that John Howard's done, that Tony Abbott's done, that all these leaders have done, not just Liberal Party, Liberal, Labour, all these mainstream leaders have done. And so when you put that in mind, my point is, yes, the fringes are a problem, but the focus, if you make the focus on them, you're missing the point. And the problem will continue. That's the point. The problem will continue because the media is going to keep doing its thing. The politicians are going to keep doing their thing. The AFP is going to keep doing its thing. And you're inevitably going to get these reactions. So at some point, we need to step back and go, no, the problem is here. The problem is in the mainstream. It's in what they do. It's foreign policy. It's domestic policy. And we need to, as Muslims, as principled Muslims who Allah has asked us to speak the truth and to take a principled stance against injustice, need to make that the focus.
Inshallah. I think those were really good takeaway points. I think it's not more so to, you know, fearmonger the people. It's more so to direct and steer the conversation where it should be. I think a lot of us have grieved over the last 2 days in regards to this situation. You know, I just haven't been functioning the same way I normally do. It's really, you know, if you're really, you know, practicing the deen, you're really, you know, Muslim, you're proud Muslim. You're seeing, you know, 50 brothers and sisters who, you know, you go to the masjid and you put your head on the ground, bow to Allah, and those same people doing those same actions, and they actually got shot while they're doing that. It's really, you know, it breaks your heart, subhanAllah. But even though we don't want to make this episode into just more, you know, condolences, we do want to provide action and initiative and what the broader kind of community, Muslim community, should be doing in order to move forward. Because as you said, you know, no one's still mourning about the Paris attacks that happened, like, you know, ages ago. There will be a time where people will just kind of move on with their life, right? So it's about how do we approach the next situation? What can we do to make sure that such a thing doesn't happen? Where should the conversation be with the broader picture? So do you have any kind of final thoughts in regards to
No, just Jazakallah khair. Absolutely, I agree with that. And I think I thank Boys in the Cave. May Allah reward you for providing a platform that allows us to push the direction in the right conversation. And may Allah accept our meager efforts in doing that. And I agree 100% that this is important. Obviously, we grieve. Obviously, it's a difficult time. But as you said, what's most important here, on top of doing what we can to help those who are most directly affected, is to see what we can do as a community and as a ummah to move in the right direction.
I mean, and definitely, for the audience and for myself, Uthman, keep the deceased and the families in the doors, inshallah. They're definitely, they'll be going such a tough time, you know, especially, you know, having a father, son, or a daughter, a mother going to their normal Jummah prayers, and, you know, they haven't returned to their family. It's a, you know, it's not easy, you know, as a family. So help.
That's right. And sorry, I should just add there that it's a more difficult situation because of the nature of the event. The deceased have not yet been buried, right? Because they're still going through the police coroner and this and autopsies and whatnot because of the nature of the event. And obviously, as Muslims, when someone dies, we want to bury them ASAP. So on top of their grief, on top of the fact that apparently there's one of the judges put a gag order on any information coming out about the deceased, it's a very difficult time for those who have survived. And we can only imagine, and you have to live that experience to really feel it. But, you know, let's keep them in our dua and do whatever we can to assist where we can, inshallah ta'ala.
Inshallah. And yeah, if you can have the capacity to donate, definitely. I know there's a few organizations doing that, so definitely reach out to them. The masjids, I think, because the masjid's ruined pretty much as well, so they have to restore that. So there's a lot of things as a Muslim community we need to stand up and assist the people with Christchurch with. So I'll wrap it up there. Jazakallah khair, Uthman, for coming on our special show today. It is our first video, but because of the nature of the circumstances, we actually did plan to go video in the future, but because of this situation, we did want to, you know, touch on it with yourself. So if you have any questions for the audience, you can, or if you have any comments as well, please email at info@boysinthecave.com. We're on Facebook, Instagram. You can check us out, inshallah, on social media. So from our special guest, Uthman Badar, and myself, we wish you all the best. This is Tanzim signing off. Assalamu alaikum.
Oh,